I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Douglas Kelly. He is he is the descendant of some of the earliest settlers of eastern North Carolina. His book is in your bibliography, and my copy of it is on the table out there if you want to look at it later, The Carolina Scots. And he's going to tell us about past and present, I think, and all the various happenings that have been going on in North Carolina on this subject. So I'm very happy to present Dr. Douglas Kelly.
Thank you very much, Diane. I appreciate all you've done in getting this organized from scratch. And I was telling my wife how thrilled I was to have an excuse to be back with Willie Ruff and Colin Martin after a number of years. And I appreciate your interest in Gaelic psalmody and in our common culture. Now, what I want to deal with a while is the basic historical religious context of the Scottish Gaelic psalmody as we had it, and to a little degree still have it, in the upper Cape Fear Valley of North Carolina. Are you hearing me all right? Okay. The colony of North Carolina, as of course it was then, is generally thought to be the largest gathering, living place of Highland Scots of the West Highlands, and particularly the island of Skye, to some degree others, Isla, Jura, etc., anywhere in the world outside the Highlands. The Earl of Selkirk said, I can't remember the exact year, writing in an English literary magazine, that North Carolina had the largest number of Highland Scots outside the Highlands anywhere. I think that is still the case. I have traveled a good bit in New Zealand and in Australia and met a lot of my fellow Scots. And I think North Carolina, as far as critical mass, certainly has had the largest numbers. I won't go into a lot of detail, but our story as immigrant Scots to Carolina starts in 1739, when the first colony of West Highland people arrived in the Cape Fear Valley. The governor of North Carolina at that time was apparently a very good statesman, Governor Gabriel Johnston. He was a lowland Scot. He was a graduate of St. Andrews University. And it was painfully obvious that the colony of North Carolina was way behind Virginia and South Carolina in economic development and in population. One of the problems is we don't have nearly such a good harbor anywhere in North Carolina, including Wilmington, as you do at, let's say, Norfolk and Charleston. Our harbors, you can get in, but it's rather difficult because of sandbars and so forth. So Governor Johnston wanted to build up the population of North Carolina under his governorship, and so he felt that the best thing that could happen to the colony would be to get a good many Highland Scottish Protestants, who for the most part were of course, Presbyterian, Church of Scotland. And he was in touch with some wealthy tacksmen, Tacksmen, kind of the running major portions of lands belonging to the chiefs or whoever. And he promised them considerable incentives if they would bring a colony of people to settle in North Carolina. And so they did this. A committee of Argyle tacksmen who were well off, Duncan Campbell of Kildusclin, Neil Hector and Archibald McNeil of west coast of Argyle, Carl McAllister and sons Hector and Alexander of Isla, and Alexander Clark and others of Jura. These men saw the position of the tacksmen. They were kind of the upper middle class coming under pressure on the Campbell estates, and also there was a depression of cattle prices in the 1730s, and so they felt if they stayed, their position as kind of, quote, upper middle class was going to be somewhat threatened and pushed down, so they were motivated to bring a lot of their cousins and friends to North Carolina. And they did this. They sailed from Campbelltown, July 1739, on the Thistle, guided by Neil Dhu McNeil of Ardeleigh, and landed in September, probably in the port of Brunswick on the lower Cape Fear River, a few miles west of the Atlantic. So Governor Johnston was true to his word. He granted them considerable tracts of free land from the king in the upper Cape Fear Valley above present-day Fayetteville, some 90 miles upstream from Brunswick and Wilmington, exemption from taxation for 10 years, and also made the head taxman immediately magistrates in what was then Bladen County. It later became Cumberland, and then after that, Moore and Harnett and some others. Well, to make a long story short, the colony prospered a great deal. They did extremely well. They sold naval stores, turpentine and these wonderful pine trees to be used in building ships and sealing ships and so forth, and they had some other crops. And they were writing back home to the West Highlands saying what a excellent situation it was, and that the Gaels were in charge of the culture, and so many more were coming. And I'll say this, from then to now in North Carolina, the Scottish immigrants never really looked upon themselves as a minority community of ethnics, as we might say today. They have always constituted the mainstream of the culture. That fact may be one reason why we lost Gaelic by the late 19th century or early 20th. To feel Highland Scottish in North Carolina is, and as far as I know, never has been, to feel strangely different, disadvantaged, or downtrodden. It is rather to know oneself to be part of what, to use an over word, the establishment, which others have tended to look to and to possibly in many ways emulate. It took the Scots a long time to organize official Presbyterian congregations. I won't go into all the details, but when the three tacksmen came from Argyll, they asked the presbytery of Inverara and Synod of Argyll to send with them a minister, the Reverend Robert Fullerton of the parish church at Glossary. He was born about 1700 and died in 1762, never having left Scotland. He wouldn't go. There were other petitions in 1741 and 1748, but nothing came of it. The ministers of the Church of Scotland were not keen to go to, sort of a wild territory. However, in later years, in 1756, the Presbyterian Synod of Philadelphia sent down a sort of traveling evangelist and church planter to the Cape Fear region, where I'm from, and which is still the heart of Gaeldom in North America. The Reverend Hugh Mccadden. Interestingly, I spent Thursday night in High Point at the home of one of his direct descendants. But anyway, Mccadden preached among these Highlanders, and they showed great appreciation for his ministry. They were glad to hear anything, although he noted at the time most of them could not understand the English in which he preached. They were all Gaelic-speaking Highlanders, but they were glad a Presbyterian preacher was there. So they tried to build him up. And he preached in homes of such leading transplanted Highlanders as Alexander, we pronounce it McCoy. It's M-C-K-A-Y, Mackay, but we still use the Gaelic McCoy. John Smith, David Smith, Bluff Hector McNeil. Mccadden, Presbyterian though he was, did not have a good chemistry with these Highlanders around Fayetteville. He wrote in his journal that they were the poorest singers I ever heard in my life. The explanation for that is simple. The Highlanders sang in the traditional way the Gaelic psalms led by a presenter, and columnist showed us that it was very likely, as my great-grandmother said, slower then than now. And to his ears it was offensive. Let me say just a word about the Gaelic psalm singing in Carolina, which is part of what brings us together here. And first, Professor Willie Ruff, I think, has done a yeoman service and a brilliant job, both in the conference of which I was a part in 2005 and since then in showing the connection of Scottish Gaelic way of lining out the Psalms, which we're practicing here today, and the development of African American spiritual music. And I won't say any more about that because Willie is much more knowledgeable than I in the matter. And as he mentioned some years ago, BBC Alaba had a fascinating broadcast on Gaelic psalmody in the Back Free Church in the Isle of Lewis. And one of my cousins in Scotland that lives in Skye rang me on the phone. He said, "Douglas, listen to this," which I did. And then later, Professor Ruff, I had the joy of welcoming him to my home then in South Carolina. Anyway, let me say, though, a little about the eclipse of Gaelic psalmody in the Cape Fear heartland. Cape Fear, Wilmington, Brunswick, on up Fayetteville, which was in Campbelltown and or Cross Hills and so forth. And the Gaelic psalmody began seriously to eclipse in the 1890s. As a little boy, I knew a lot of my elderly relatives whose clear memory went back to the 1870s. So it's in my lifetime, and of course, they knew the old way of Gaelic line singing. The Reverend James Mackenzie wrote an interesting book. I believe it was 1969. It's entitled Colorful Heritage, The Story of Barbecue, Bluff, and Longstreet Churches. And I quote what he says about a rather young, brash, progressively minded minister at Bluff Presbyterian Church not too far from Fayetteville in the 1890s. He'd come there from the seminary, probably Union Seminary, which is where I went. And 1890s, remember this, is 150 years after the 1739 colony that first settled our state with Highland Scots. Quote, this young minister in Old Bluff Church, which overlooks the Cape Fear River. From this day forward, he declared from the pulpit, there will be no more of these mournful Gaelic psalms sung in this church. Instead, we will sing modern hymns like everybody else, set to good, fast American tunes. When the first hymn was announced, one man stood up and walked out, followed by his family. Fearing he had offended him, as indeed he had, the now rather subdued seminary student went to visit this man the same afternoon. And the man said, "You may sing those silly little ditties if you wish, but as for me and my house, we will sing the Psalms of David to the tunes of David and in the language of David." Column, is that the regulative principle? Well, I'm not going to I've got a good bit of material here about the history of the three major Scottish Presbyterian churches founded in the Upper Cape Fear in 1758, and they were strong churches surrounded by the Highland Scots and their children and grandchildren, and then by the slaves who belonged to them, and they were very well attended. Most of the immigrants to the Cape Fear Valley, particularly the Upper Cape Fear, from 1739 to the late 1760s, came from Argyll. However, after about 1770, huge numbers began to immigrate from the Isle of Skye, which is where a lot of my people are from. No doubt the most famous immigrants we ever had were Flora and Alan MacDonald, who lived not too far from our family home. They came in 1774, and Flora and Alan regularly worshiped at Barbecue Presbyterian Church in now Harnett County, and it was in Gaelic in the morning and English in the afternoon. And anyway, Flora is said to have been, I've got some detailed description of it, very handsome person, even in her life, a very dignified Scottish Presbyterian woman. Well, it was difficult for us, the Revolutionary War. I've got a lot of details. I'm not going to take the time to go into it, but we were badly divided. My father's family, Highland Scottish, were Tories or loyalists to the king. My mother's family, further down in the state of North Carolina, were revolutionaries. And anyway, one of the reasons that so many of the Scots in Moore County, Upper Cumberland and that, as my own people, were loyal to the king was that they had taken an oath of loyalty to the House of Hanover to be allowed to immigrate. And they tried to live by the Westminster Confession of Faith, which is based largely on Holy Scripture. And in chapter 22 of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which these Presbyterians took very, very seriously, it's a chapter entitled of Lawful Oaths and Vows. It says, the confession does, and the ministers have to swear to it, and the elders have to swear to it to be ordained, that one is bound to keep an oath even if it is made to an atheist. Now let me say, I've read a lot of historical work on why so many were loyalists in my part of the Cape Fear, and so many modern historians, very able men, I don't doubt it, but totally discount any theological motivation. But you see, that's bad historiography. You've got to go back and try to put yourself in the mental, emotional mode of the people who were acting at that time. If you read your own sensitivities or lack of sensitivities on to people 250 years ago, you will not understand. So I think the theological was very important, as in our own family, because they took the oath. And then also a good many of these Scots, there was certainly an economic motivation, were reserve officers in the British Army. Two of my ancestors were reserve officers in the British Army when they came. One of them was Captain John Martin, and the other one, I forget his rank, was John Campbell Blue. And both of them fought on the side of the loyalist of the king, and both of them had to leave the state. Captain John Martin had been captured at Moores Creek Battleground, and he was very, very fervently for the king, and he was so angry, and he was let go in an exchange of officers and then fought on the British side, even down in Florida territory, and finally got through. And he was so angry that the revolutionaries had won, he literally left the colony, went first to Nova Scotia, then back to Skye, and lived to be 103 years old. I was preaching in Kilmuir in Skye and wanted to find his grave, and somebody knew where it was, but the communion season kept me so busy I couldn't go. But next time I'm there, I'm going to find his grave. However, he left a son in North Carolina, which is why we're here. And also the other one, John Campbell Blue, left North Carolina when the British lost, with a wife and 2 children, up to Nova Scotia. But after about 4 years, his wife died. He couldn't raise the children, so he came back to his parents in Moore County, and he married a second time, and the first wife had 2 children, second wife had 12, and I'm descended from the second wife, one of those 12. So that's why, although I'm from a bunch of loyalists, that's why we're still in North Carolina. Then, of course, there was the War of Secession, 1861 to 65. It was very difficult for us. In a sense, my family has been on the losing side in 2 wars. In the Revolution, we were on the King's side, and in the war between states, we were Confederates, and we lost on both counts. I've often said to my children, don't do what my ancestor did, you will lose. However, we have kept the property we have at the bank, the oath of loyalty my ancestor Duncan Blue took to North Carolina in 1781. I've still got that, and we were able to keep the plantation. Anyway, to show how much religion in Scotland was still meaning to North Carolina even during the war between the states, let me quote a letter that a distant cousin, Judge John W. Smith in Wilmington, North Carolina, sent me some years ago. It had been written by one of his relatives in the Confederate Army in Cape Fear area in 1863 to his Aunt Anna. Well, Aunt Anna, to tell you the truth, I have begun to have some fear that we will make a failure in our struggle for independence, as I see in the religious papers that the Church of Scotland has made a strong protest against us, as Scottish churches critique them for their practice of slavery. And when the churches begin to denounce us, I begin to feel weak indeed. I could stand to be opposed by the world and still hope we were right, but I never could feel myself at liberty to oppose the Church of Jesus Christ. And that's John Smith in the Confederate Army. Now, briefly, let me bring before you 5 major areas of religious life among the Presbyterians of the Upper Cape Fear, and in all of them we're going to get into the speaking and the singing of Gaelic, and it's indeed mostly its termination. These things I want to mention from the Upper Cape Fear Valley Scots are preaching, sacraments, revival, church discipline, and education. Preaching, I've got a lot of material here on the early preachers. I just don't think there's time to go into it today, or that you really need to do that. But the early preachers were all Gaelic, because they wouldn't have been understood otherwise. And we have their names and when they were ordained and so forth, and I could give you all that, but I won't. But one Gaelic minister still remembered in my district, and we have very long memories because we live in the same houses on the same land for way over 200 years, as I do, was Reverend Dougal Crawford, who arrived in 1783 and was preacher at Raft Swamp Presbyterian Church in Robeson County. And he did some preaching at Barbecue, where Flora went, Longstreet, and elsewhere. He was born in Arran in 1752, educated at Glasgow University, and licensed by the Presbytery of Dunoon in 1781. One of his famous early sermons has the intriguing title, A Mental Toothpick for the Fair Sex. Excuse the pun, but the title certainly pricked my interest. He delivered it in Gaelic and English, and I have not seen a copy of it yet. But a book of his sermons was published by Gaelic Printing Company. We had Gaelic publishers in Fayetteville. Several of their books still are extant. And I have a copy of this book of his of two fairly long sermons in the archives of First Presbyterian Church of Fayetteville, North Carolina. And the first sermon expounds Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. And the second sermon, Micah 2:10. Arise ye and depart, for this is not your rest. The second of these two sermons was translated into English in the 1960s by the Reverend Donald Budgie, then of Dunvegan in Skye. Now, Scottish Presbyterian preaching in the 18th and 19th century had two contradictory streams of thought or of theological motivation: evangelicals and moderatists. The evangelicals stressed personal knowledge of Christ, the need for conversion, and was rather more in the old Puritan mode. The moderatists were influenced by the European Enlightenment and Scottish Enlightenment, of course, and emphasized natural religion, general morality, and de-emphasized such things as miracles and personal experiences of God. Now, Dr. John Witherspoon, an evangelical who left Scotland to become president of College of New Jersey, namely Princeton, in the 1770s, wrote a famous spoof against the moderates in 1753, Ecclesiastical Characteristics, and some say it earned him so many enemies in Scotland it was one reason he was open to the call to Princeton. I don't know. So I was wondering about Dougal Crawford. Was he a moderatist or was he evangelical? And I'm not going to give you all the reasons, but I did read his sermons, and it's very clear he's an evangelical, as were nearly all the ministers in our district. He declares the divinity of Christ and the need for personal conversion to him, the brevity of life, and so forth. And I've got some details on his sermons that I won't go into, but they were delivered in Gaelic, and we still have them. He was disappointed in a romance, apparently, and returned to Scotland, where he died many years later. I don't know if he ever found a wife or not. There were many other Gaelic preachers in our region who were homegrown. That is, they were born in North Carolina. In 1801, Orange Presbytery, meeting at Barbecue Presbyterian Church, licensed 7 young ministerial students of Dr. David Caldwell, who was one of the founders of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, my alma mater. These young students were Malcolm McNair, Duncan Brown, Murdoch Murphy, Murdoch McMillan, John Matthews, Hugh Shaw, and Ezekiel B. Curry. They were the children of immigrants and are said to have been able to preach in Gaelic as well as any island preacher. They were known as, quote, the young Scotch preachers. I have not yet found any of their sermons, but I would certainly like to do so. And the other preachers I mentioned here, I won't go into the situation, but I'll say maybe the most famous Gaelic preacher was at Union Presbyterian Church, where all my family's buried, and we still go there on Wednesday nights to prayer meeting. It was Reverend Angus McCallum. He was preacher there for a number of years, and in his time, the great revival of 1833 occurred. We still have letters in the family, and there are many historical accounts of this revival. It was so powerful. When I was writing the Blue family history a number of years ago, different members of the family gave me obituaries that had been written in the 1890s about these people that had died in the 1890s in our district, and it often said, so-and-so was a subject of the saving work of the Holy Spirit at Union Revival in 1833, and her life, or his life, proved ever true afterwards. So those revivals did have a great influence on our territory, and some think maybe the influence yet continues. The last two Gaelic preachers of the Upper Cape Fear region were Reverend John Campbell Sinclair of Tiree, and some others I'm going to tell you about. He was born in 1800, first came to Nova Scotia 1838, and finally to Fayetteville, North Carolina, 1857. And he wrote a letter home, published in the Inverness Courier in 1857, and talks about how the Gaelic language is still spoken in its purity by many in these counties, Cumberland, Robeson, Bladen, Moore, and Harnett. And in both of his churches, Barbecue and Galatia, he preached in it every Sabbath. And he goes into a lot of details about it that I'd like to share with you. His successor, Reverend James McKenzie, he succeeded Sinclair 100 years later, in my time, at Barbecue. And he met some old people that's been 1960s, so they've been born in 1870s, 1880s, and they still remembered hearing Reverend Sinclair preaching Gaelic at one of the churches. And they say Sinclair was maybe not always wise in the way he introduced a sermon. He would start it with a rhetorical question. At times it got him into trouble, and I quote from Reverend McKenzie, "To illustrate the importance of daily family prayer, he asked a little boy in the congregation in English, 'What does your father say just before you retire for the night?' The boy replied in Gaelic, 'Curamak ku,' put the dog out." Another thing, this is extraneous, but I can't resist it. When I was in Holyrood Abbey Church of Scotland as a student, I wasn't there that Sunday, but everybody said it. There was a theological student from New College, and the children's sermon made a very severe mistake. He was in the pulpit and he said, "Now children," he was going to preach on purity and language. "Now children, what are some of the bad things that we say?" And one little boy put out a stream of blue profanity such as you never heard in your life. But the preacher asked him. I think that man would have learned a lesson that day. Well, towards the end of his ministry, Reverend Sinclair organized a number of the black members into a church known as Love Grove, which had Gaelic services most Sundays. Later, Love Grove Church, and it still exists, joined the AME, African Methodist Episcopal. And let me say what Reverend Sinclair wrote in Untitled, published in Toronto in 1872, about this black Presbyterian church. "I have met with a number of colored persons who speak the Gaelic language as well as if they had been raised in any of the Hebrides. There's no Gaelic preached in the Carolinas now, nor likely to be in the future," he says, and this is actually, he wasn't correct. "I was the last Gaelic minister in the state and preached in that language for 8 years among my countrymen." He died in West Virginia out of daughters in 1878. Actually, we know of two other Gaelic ministers in North Carolina, one in North Carolina, one in South Carolina, who were third-generation Scottish descendants and spoke excellent enough Gaelic that they could preach in it. One was the Reverend James Steadman Black. I knew his grandson when I was ordained at Fayetteville Presbyterian in the 60s. And he was third generation, and he preached regularly in Gaelic, and indeed he wrote out a number of his sermons and translated them into Gaelic for the edification of the people that wanted it. I've often wished I'd asked his grandson if he had access to those sermons, and I may see if I can get in touch with some of the grandson's descendants. Anyway, down in the PD, which is where Florence, Dillon, and all that is, in South Carolina, there was a Reverend Dunlop who was preaching in Gaelic in what is now called Dillon County. Then it was Marion County, South Carolina. And it is said that he was preaching till 1898 in Gaelic regularly to the many Highland descendants. I think it's time's moving on. I had a lot to say about the sacraments. I can't do it because I don't want to keep you from your lunch or from mine. I'm not that virtuous to be concerned about you, but it's about me. The communion seasons were central to the Scottish Presbyterianism of Cape Fear Valley, North Carolina, and over into South Carolina. The communion season started with services on Thursday. It was a fasting day, and then continuing through Friday, Saturday, the communion day on Sunday, and there'd be so many thousands they had to serve the tables outside the churches. By the way, Union Presbyterian near Carthage was in the 1830s the largest Presbyterian church in North Carolina, if you count both the white members and the African American members. It was over 700 membership and huge attendances. Even First Presbyterian Wilmington and First Presbyterian Charlotte couldn't come up to the numbers because it was the territory was so Scottish. And they had these communion seasons. People came from 40 miles around, and I have a long description by Reverend Daniel McGilvery, whose parents came from Isle of Skye in 1803 on the same ship with the Kellys. And he talks about it. I'll just read you a little. Services began on Friday and closed on Monday. The regular order was a special prayer meeting, breakfast, a prayer meeting at 9, a sermon at 10, an intermission, then another sermon. The sermons were not accounted of much worth if they were not an hour long. The pulpit was the tall, old-fashioned box pulpit with a sounding board above it. For want of room in the church, the 2 sermons on Sunday were preached from a stand in the open air, and they passed out the tokens, so forth and so on. And it was a beautiful description, but I can't say too much. I've mentioned a little bit the revivals. Some amazing things happened in those revivals. A lot of the Presbyterians were pleased with it. Most of the ministers of Fayetteville Presbytery, which is the heart of the Cape Fear Scottish settlement, approved of the revival. Some were critical. There were certainly some emotional excesses. I wouldn't say it's an emotional excess to be knocked flat to the ground. Some of my own family was knocked flat. The power of the Spirit came in such a way. So I wasn't there, and I don't criticize it. No. But there were some noises and some strange things that upset a lot of the more staid Presbyterians. But nonetheless, I think that the general effect was morally elevating on the territory. But I think something slightly negative occurred in conjunction with the revivals, and that was it was kind of a outburst of a new Puritanism. And there was such criticism of any form of dancing that they turned against the bagpipes. We had a lot of bagpiping tradition, but a lot of times people got converted. They would burn their bagpipes. And they felt that bagpipes were used to encourage dancing, and so many in the church were against them, and we lost the tradition for 100 years or so. And also there was movements against any kind of representational art and sculpture for a long time. That's coming back. Then, briefest word on church discipline. I can't go into it very much, but the sessions were overseeing as best they could, the lives of the people. You were expected to be sincere if you were a member of the Presbyterian Church. And particularly before communions, everybody had to come before the session if they were going to get a communion token. And if the session knew you'd been fighting with another church member, or they'd been fighting within your family, serious disputes or breakdown of relationships within the community, they'd call you before the session, and before they give you the communion, they would ask you to apologize. They didn't keep you from the communion if you'd committed a sin. That they didn't do. But they called on you to repent and to reconcile. It was probably a sessional discipline, a major instrument of much reconciliation, including marriage reconciliation. I've read in the session minutes of Union Presbyterian Church how the session called up one man who literally beat up his wife. And they dealt with him, and they dealt with him fairly in a way that they, I think probably needed to. But serious discipline was gone shortly after World War I, and I could give you the reasons. Not time. Just one final thing on education. Scots everywhere in Scotland, outside Scotland, of Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, Episcopal, have all been very, very keen on education. And one of the first things they did when they got those churches going after 1758 was set up. They sometimes meet in the church, or sometimes a log building next to the church, to educate the children. And before that, they would have what they call professors, teachers, that board around in the different homes and instruct the children. And those, what they call Oldfield Academies, mostly prepared young men to go either University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and then Davidson was founded in 1837, or Princeton, College in New Jersey, where a lot went. And the first institution to educate women was by the Moravians in Winston-Salem, Salem Academy, 1772. And maybe the second one was down in our territory called Floral College in 1841, set up with the Presbyterians to educate our women. And then later that developed into other institutions I won't give you. Now, why did we lose Gaelic? In my memory, I'm 71, although I look older, feel older sometimes than that even. Anyway, the Cape Fear Scots continued to use Gaelic at home until between World War I and II. I heard it. And some church services were still going on, but not too many. Why did we lose it then? It was because the Carolina Scots did not feel that Gaelic was appropriate to teach to their children in school. The children heard them speak it at home, and many of them, down to 3 generations, could preach in it. But not at school. At those schools, whether were Oldfield Academies or professors called to move around the prominent families, they taught English, French, Latin, and Greek. Never Gaelic. My great-grandmother, Mary McCrumman, who married Peter Blue in 1875, she was taught in the what you'll call a dame school in her father's plantation, the McCrumman plantation, by her 2 elderly aunts, Aunt Bella and Aunt Liza, and I have some of their books and so forth. Aunt Bella and Aunt Liza spoke Gaelic every day in the McCrumman home, and at Ben Salem Presbyterian Church, sometimes Union or Bethesda. But they never taught their nieces and nephews, great nieces and nephews, any Gaelic. I reckon it was because they felt that the children, when they got into their early youth, would go either to Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, or Princeton, or maybe Davidson. And none of those institutions taught Gaelic. Of course, the Scottish universities didn't at this time. It was much later that Celtic departments were added in the various Scottish universities, so they didn't have it in the Scottish universities, and we didn't have it in our American universities, and therefore the children were not prepared for exams, and so we lost it. However, I'm hoping, I've been interested in the story of how Hebrew was revived a number of years ago, 100 and some years ago. This great Jewish scholar, Hebrew had been about lost as far as the spoken language. Yes, they knew the Torah, but was about gone. And this great scholar poured out his life and successfully revived the speaking, the singing, and the rest of Hebrew. And then that was ready when the Jewish people got what we now call the Holy Land in 1948. And I tend to think that why couldn't Gaelic be revived if the Lord lets Willie Ruff and Colin McCallum and my humble self live long enough? Maybe we'll have a hand in doing it. And Diane McCullough, we're going to call on her for a lot of help in doing that. So I appreciate your attention, and that's just a little bit kind of a rundown of Gaelic in North Carolina. Diane.
Can you just give us a few more details about Love's Grove, AME, and how they carried on down?
Yes, I can. It was in the Scottish Presbyterian churches in Cape Fear Valley. There was a tendency after the war was over in 1865 for many of the younger African American members to leave and start their own churches. Many of the older ones stayed. When my father was born in 1907, they still had considerable black membership in Union Presbyterian Church, where our family went. And so it was the Scottish, oddly enough, the Scottish Presbyterian churches, so far as I know, never had the legal practice of racial segregation. They didn't have it. In nearly all the Scottish Presbyterian churches, particularly many of the older African Americans, stayed. They wouldn't leave. Their children and grandchildren, many of them did leave. And it was a group that came out of these churches, particularly Union and Barbecue, that founded not too far from and also Buffalo, not too far from Sanford, Love Grove Church. It later, I couldn't tell you the exact year it went into the AME. But even after it had gone into the AME, the elders, the African American elders who were most familiar with the language of the soul with Scottish Gaelic, would ask Reverend J.S. Black to come and preach once a month a Gaelic service, and they continued to sing, in the way that we're trying to do here. And I've never attended Love Grove myself, but some of the rest of you have, and it's no Gaelic now, but there's a vital congregation there of African American Christians. Yeah, does that answer it?
Yeah. Do they do lining out there, or do they do the harmonic?
Harmonic, so far as I know. And I think they've done harmonic probably since World War II, since the 1940s, which is about what the whites have done. Yeah. Any other question? If we've got time, I'm glad to do what I can. All right, then. Diane will tell you where to go after this.